Welcome back to Dad After. Over the last few weeks, I've shared why I started this podcast. I shared the day my house went silent. I shared some things nobody told me about starting over. Today, I want to talk about something that took me not to my family, not to my friends, not to anyone else. To myself. I think every man has a moment where he has to look in the mirror, not to fix his hair or shave, not because he's getting ready for work, but because he can't avoid the man staring back at him anymore. I had that moment, and to be honest, I didn't really like what I saw. Not because of what I look like, but because of who I thought I'd become. I want to be really careful with what I'm about to say, because words matter, especially when we're talking about ourselves. I never believed that I was a failure, but I absolutely believed that I had failed. And there's a difference, a huge difference. One is your identity, the other is your actions. And if we confuse the two, we can spend the rest of our lives believing we're someone God never said we were. When I looked into the mirror, I didn't see one mistake. I saw a husband whose marriage had ended. I saw a father who wasn't tucking his kids into bed every night. I saw a provider who felt like he wasn't providing the way he wanted to. I saw dreams that hadn't become reality and goals that still lived on paper. I saw a man carrying disappointment. Not just disappointed in life, disappointed in himself. That's a hard thing to admit out loud. But because as men, we're taught to project strength, to keep moving, to keep grinding, to put our heads down and figure it out. And there's truth in that. But there's also danger. Because if all we ever do is keep moving, we never stop long enough to ask ourselves the hard questions. I had spent a long time blaming circumstances, blaming timing, blaming everything around me. Not because those things didn't matter. Some of them absolutely did. But eventually, I realized there was one question I couldn't keep avoiding. What kind of man am I becoming? Not what happened to me. Not whose fault is it. Not why is my life different than I thought it would be. Those questions have their place, but they weren't the ones that were going to change my future. The question that mattered was this: when my son grows up, what kind of man will he remember? When my daughter tells people about her dad, what story will she tell? That question hit me harder than anything else. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the example I was leaving behind. And I knew before I could become the man I wanted my children to remember, I had to be honest with the man looking back at me in the mirror. And you know what made that mirror even harder to look at? Comparison. I don't think we talk about comparison enough as men, because we don't always compare ourselves the way people think we do. We're not usually comparing clothes or cars or who has the nicest house. We're comparing something much deeper. We're comparing the lives we thought we'd have to the lives we see other men living. I remember looking around men in my life, my brother working hard and doing well for himself, my uncle building a successful business and living a life most people would dream about, my jiu-jitsu coach running multiple businesses while somehow still making time to pour into other people. Friends, family, people I respected. Everywhere I looked, it seemed like everybody else had life figured out. And then there was me, 34 years old, working on my backflow business, door dashing to help make ends meet, trying to rebuild my life, trying to rebuild my finances, trying to rebuild myself. Some days, I felt like everyone else had gotten a head start. You ever felt that way? Like somehow you missed the class where everyone else learned how to be successful. Like everybody else got the instruction manual, and yours just never showed up. I know I did. And the more I compared, the worse I felt. Because comparison has a way of taking everything you've accomplished and making it feel invisible. It doesn't matter what you've overcome. Comparison won't let you celebrate it. It only points to the next guy, the next paycheck, the next business, promotion, house, truck, vacation. It whispers, you should be further along. You should have figured this out by now. You should be more. And if you listen to that voice long enough, you'll start believing your worth is measured by what you've built instead of the man you're becoming. I'm not proud to admit, but there are days I question everything. I question whether I've wasted years of my life, whether I'll ever catch up. I question whether I was going to be a good provider or become the provider that I wanted to be. Because there's one thing that weighs on a father. It's feeling like he can't give his kids everything he wants to give them. Not because they ask for expensive things, but because every time you have to say no, it feels personal. It feels like you're letting them down. I can still remember those moments, standing in a store, looking at something my kids wanted, doing the math in my head before I ever answered, wondering if I could make it work, wondering if I should put it on a credit card, or if maybe my next paycheck would be better. Then having to say, not today. I don't think my kids ever saw it the way that I did. To them, Dad just said no. But inside, I was carrying the weight of believing I wasn't giving them the life that they deserved. The truth is, I wasn't just comparing bank accounts. I was comparing myself. I had started believing that because I wasn't where I wanted to be financially, I wasn't the man I wanted to be. And that is a dangerous place for any father to live. Because when your identity becomes tied to your income, every hard season starts to feel like a verdict on your value. Looking back now, I realize I wasn't really fighting other people's success. I was fighting the expectations that I had placed on myself. And that fight shows up every single time I've looked in the mirror. There was something else I had to admit to myself. And honestly, this one was harder than talking about money, harder than talking about failure, about comparison, because this one involved the two people I love more in this world than anything. That's my kids. There were days I'd come home exhausted, been working, trying to grow my business, trying to make a little extra money, trying to figure out how to keep everything together. And by the time I walked through the door, I felt like I'd already lived 2 days in one. Then something small would happen. A toy left on the floor, someone asking for another snack, a little argument between brother and sister. The kinds of things kids do every single day. And I'd feel myself getting frustrated. Sometimes quicker than I should have. Sometimes louder than I should have. It took me a while to realize something. I wasn't really angry at them. I was angry at myself. They weren't the reason I was frustrated. They just happened to be standing closest to the frustration I was already carrying. And that's a painful thing to admit, because they deserved a dad who was present, not a dad whose mind was still fighting battles from work. They deserved patience, not pressure. They deserved my attention, not the leftovers of my day. I started asking myself a hard question. What am I bringing through that front door? Not my bag, not my tools, not my lunch. What am I carrying inside? Because my kids didn't know how much money was in the account. They don't know what business problems I'm having or trying to solve. They don't know what bills are due. Hell, they don't even know the pressure I felt every day to become more. They just knew Dad was home. And to them, that moment mattered. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something. My children weren't asking me to be perfect. They weren't asking me to be a millionaire. They weren't asking for a father who had every single answer. They were just asking for me. The man who would wrestle on the living room floor. The dad who would listen to their stories, even if they'd already told them 100 times. The father who would laugh with them, pray with them, hold them, show up. Kids don't remember your stress nearly as much as they remember your presence. That realization changed something in me. Not overnight, but little by little. I started trying to leave work at work. Not because the problems disappeared. They didn't. The bills were still there. The business still needed my attention. The pressure was still real. But I realized something. My children shouldn't have to carry burdens that belong to me. They're already growing up in a world that's gonna give them enough weight to carry. They don't need me adding mine to their shoulders. And maybe that's something another dad listening today needs to hear. It's okay to tell your kids that you're tired. It's okay to let them see that you're human. But don't let your disappointment become the atmosphere they grow up in. Don't let the battles you're fighting convince them they're the problem. Because most of the time, they're not. Looking back, I don't remember every bill that's gotten paid. I can't remember every long day that I've worked. But I do remember little arms wrapped around my neck. I remember hearing, "Daddy, watch this." Or my son's backpack hitting the ground as he burst out of the school doors. Because he's more excited to run and give me a hug than he was to tell me about school. I remember my daughter wrapping her arms around my waist like nothing else in the world mattered. Those moments reminded me of something I almost forgotten. to my kids, I wasn't measured by my paycheck. I was measured by my presence. And maybe I'd been looking in the wrong mirror all along. After spending so much time looking at everything I wasn't, I finally asked myself a different question. What does success actually look like to me? Not social media, not to the world, not to the guy driving the nicer truck, but to me. For a long time, I think I borrowed someone else's definition. Success, making more money, growing a bigger business, owning more, doing more, achieving more. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with wanting those things. I still want to build a successful business. I still want financial freedom. I still want to give my kids experiences I never had. I still want to be able to say yes more than I have to say no. Those are good goals, but I realized something. If I reached every financial goal I ever set and lost my relationship with my kids along the way, I wouldn't call that success. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Success isn't just about what you build. It's about who you become while you're building it. Because one day, my business won't matter to my kids the way I think it will. They probably won't remember how many hours I worked. They won't remember every invoice I sent or every problem I solved. But they'll remember how I made them feel. They'll remember if Dad looked up when they walked into the room. They'll remember if I kept my word. They'll remember if I showed up. I started asking myself, if my son described me 20 years from now, what would I hope he'd say? Would he say my dad made a lot of money? Or would he say my dad was always there when I needed him? If my daughter tells her children about me one day, I hope she doesn't start with what I owned. I hope she starts with who I was. That I loved them, that I listened, that I made them feel safe, that when life got hard, I didn't quit being their dad. That's when something shifted inside of me. I stopped chasing success just so I could prove something, and I started chasing it because I wanted to build a better future for the people I love. One comes from pride. The other comes from purpose. Purpose has a way of keeping you on your feet and keeping your feet planted to the ground. It reminds you why you're working so hard in the first place. I still have dreams, big ones. I want to build a business that provides freedom. I want to take my kids on vacation where money isn't the first thing I think about. I want them to experience life. I want to leave them something to build on. I want to walk through my front door one day surrounded by people I love and know that I gave them the best of myself. Not just what was left after work. Those dreams still matter. Maybe now they matter even more. Because they aren't about proving my worth to anyone. They're about serving the people who mean the most to me. Looking back, I don't think the mirror was lying to me. It was just incomplete. It showed me where I had fallen short, but it couldn't show me where I was headed. That part was still being written. And maybe that's true for you too. If all you see today is the man you've been, don't stop looking, because God isn't finished shaping the man you're becoming. Failure may have gotten my attention, but it didn't get to write the ending of my story. That decision will be mine. I spent a lot of time talking about the man I saw in the mirror, the man who felt like he'd failed, the man who compared himself, the man who questioned whether he was enough, who carried disappointment. But there's one more man I want to talk about, the man I want to become. Because here's what I've learned. The mirror can tell you where you are. It can't tell you where you're going. That's your choice, every single day. For a long time, I thought becoming a better father meant waiting until I had everything figured out. Waiting until the business was thriving, the finances were where I wanted them to be. Waiting until life felt stable again. But my kids weren't waiting for a finished version of me. They were growing up. Every day, every birthday, school year, conversation, or hug. Those moments don't pause while we are trying to get our lives together. That realization changed me, because I understood something I wish I had understood sooner. My children don't need a perfect father. They need a present one. They don't need a dad who never struggles. They need a dad who shows them what it looks like to keep going. They don't need a man who's never failed. They need one who owns his failures, learns from them, and gets back up. Because one day, my son's going to fail at something. One day, my daughter's going to wonder if she's enough. When that day comes, I don't want them remembering a father who pretended life was easy. I want them remembering a father who faced hard seasons with honesty, faith, and perseverance. I still have days where I wish I were further ahead. I still have goals that aren't finished and dreams that I'm chasing. I still have moments where I catch myself comparing. I'm still becoming, and maybe I always will be, but I'm no longer waiting to become the father my kids need. I'm choosing to be that father today, with what I have, where I am. If you're listening to this, and you've been staring at your own mirror, I want to leave you with something. Stop asking whether you're perfect. Ask whether you're moving forward. Stop asking whether you've arrived. Ask whether you're growing. Stop asking whether you failed. Ask, what are you going to do next? Because those questions, they change everything. One of the greatest lies I believed was that my worst chapter had already written the rest of my story. It hadn't. It had written one chapter, not the whole book. The man in the mirror wasn't the final version of me. He was the version that had finally become honest enough to change. And sometimes that's where real rebuilding begins. So if today you're looking in the mirror and all you can see are your mistakes, look a little longer. Because behind the disappointment, comparison, regret, there's still a father. There's still a man worth becoming. There's still someone your children are watching. Not because you've been perfect, but because you're still standing. You're still showing up, loving them, and fighting for them. And maybe That's what courage really looks like. Thank you for spending this time with me. Next week, I want to talk about something every father carries, whether he realizes it or not. The weight we carry, the responsibilities, the expectations, the invisible burdens that shape the men we become. Until then, when you look in the mirror tomorrow morning, don't just ask yourself what kind of man is staring back at you. Ask yourself, what kind of man do I want my son to become because he watched me? What kind of man do I want my daughter to believe she deserves because she was loved by me? Those questions are bigger than any paycheck, bigger than any business, bigger than any mistake. They're the questions that build a legacy. This is Dad After. Because life changed, fatherhood didn't. In your story, it isn't over.